So, after the fight between Angstrom and Invincible, it looks like Invincible has killed Angstrom. However, Angstrom survived the carnage and opened a portal to another dimension to have his injuries treated. His encounter with Mark would leave him with a disfigured face and a large scar that was across his lip and eye. In order to get his revenge, he traveled to dozens of different dimensions and gathered many evil variants of Mark. He told them that he would help them to expand their empire after they helped him kill Mark and destroy Earth of his dimension. So he unleashes the 16 alternate Marks he gathered upon the original Mark's reality. Angstrom tells the alternate Marks to go across the globe and destroy cities, and that he will fulfill their parts of the bargain. Meanwhile, Mark and Eve are relaxing at Eve's house. Mark asks to meet her parents, and Eve reluctantly accepts. Meanwhile, the evil Marks spring into action and attack various locations such as Stronghold Penitentiary, London, Moscow, New York, with one fighting Spawn who is using his cape and chains to restrain him. That Mark has claimed to have killed Spawn before. Another fight is Firebreather in Los Angeles, who in his dimension is king of the monsters. Another Mark is fighting Tech Jacket in Earth's orbit. Soon Mark and Eve also join the battlefield. Mark begins fighting his alternate version with a Mohawk who is evenly matched with him. Mark smashes his temples with his fist and the Cape's crew attack him, mistaking him for the alternate version. Wolfman, who has been in prison, is fighting Thrillkill, who is trying to escape. He knocks him out and sees Powerplex attempting to escape. The collapse of the prison provides Scott with enough energy. He sees Mark battling the Capes and says that he will deal with Mark soon, but not now. Meanwhile, many people including April, Debbie, Amber, William and Rick watch in horror as they hear about the alternate Mark laying waste to the cities across the globe. A Mark is attempting to kill Eve and another is fighting Oliver. Meanwhile, in the Pentagon, Britt, Donald finished killing an alternate Mark, with Donald losing most of his human skin. Cecil has his arm broken in the aftermath and tells Donald to call as many superheroes as possible to deal with the evil Marks. So, on the second day, Donald calls the Dynamo 5, Youngblood, and various other teams. Mark and Eve rushes to assist the Cyberforce in fighting another Mark. Meanwhile, Pitt has managed to kill an evil Mark by mashing his thumbs into his eyes, but not without taking damage. He falls to the ground afterwards. Shadowhawk and Madman attempt to fight Invincible, who has claimed to kill his father. Savage Dragon, Mighty Man and Angel are having trouble handling a Mark, while Jackie Estacado fights one. Sarah Pizzini fights one as well, and Mark takes an injured Eve to the hospital. One evil Mark manages to defeat the Guardians, decapitate Immortal, and kill many of Kate's duplicates, but Darkwing pulls him into the Shadow World and sacrifices himself in order to kill that evil Mark. Robot and other resigned Guardians are injured by one of them, and Amanda is unconscious from the battle. One evil Mark attempts to kill the injured trio, but Bulletproof holds him off, though previously he lost his hand. Another Mark continues fighting Oliver, calling him a lesser Viltrumite. Debbie and Paul continue watching the news. An injured Black Samson and Shapesmith look for Darkwing and begin to realize he was likely killed by the evil Mark he took with him. Rex has Bulletproof take Robot and Amanda with him while Rex stays behind. Rex makes a sacrifice to kill an evil Mark. While an evil Mark holds him by his neck, he ignites his skeleton, turning himself into a suicide bomb. The charge kills them both, and Robot watches in horror as his friend dies. Meanwhile, Pitt, Savage Dragon, and the Youngbloods lay unconscious, but an evil Mark lies dead. Mark looks in grief at Eve, and Cecil asks for his help. Mark refuses, citing that he has every superhero is helping already. Another Mark is killed by the Reaniman, and Sarah Pizzini lays unconscious, while Savage Dragon looks on at the carnage caused by the alternate Marks. On the third day, 8 evil Marks were killed, and only 8 have survived. They look on in pleasure after destroying many of the cities, including Tokyo, Sydney, Paris, and Seattle. Angstrom arrives to the 8 alive Marks and asks them to bring his reality's Mark. They refuse and tell him to fulfill his end of the bargain, but he strands them in the dimension he was supposedly killed in. Soon, Mark, Oliver, and Bulletproof find him. Angstrom launches his orbs at the trio and knocks 2 of them back. Mark crushes an orb after he launches into him. Mark grabs his neck and Oliver insists that Mark kill Angstrom since he has caused all this damage. Mark attempts to kill him, but he escapes through a dimensional portal. Before he does, Mark tears his forearm off. Angstrom returns back and asks the medical team to repair his arm, and they say that Angstrom hasn't fulfilled his promises and he works for them now. On the 4th day, many homes and areas were destroyed by the attack. Mark looks in horror at the carnage caused by his alternate versions. The news report about what happened in the Invincible War. Many cities were leveled and thousands were killed. Savage Dragon was interviewed and says that their realities, Mark didn't do it. Mark watches Eve in horror as she clings to her life. Cecil arrives to ask Mark for help in the cleanup effort. Mark accepts, but says that he won't help Cecil again. The various superheroes help with the cleanup of Manhattan and begin saving those who survived the aftermath. But then, Mark is attacked by Powerplex, blaming him for causing the destruction. The Youngblood is ready to help Mark, and one fires an arrow at Powerplex, giving him energy. Mark uses the time to attack him and asks someone to hold him, so he uses his energy. Badrock pushes him to the ground, and Mark tells him to fight through the pain. However, Badrock's rock physiology makes him immune to Scott electricity. Badrock takes Scott with him to the teleporter Cecil used. Scott is baffled at the heroes for not helping him, citing that Mark's alternate counterparts were killing all those people. Mark looks depressed and goes back to the hospital and tells Eve of how the superheroes are working together. Eve's parents arrive and her father pushes him aside. Mark leaves and her mother follows him to apologize. Mark accepts and she tells him of Eve's friend who had died in Chicago. In the destroyed apartment of Russ Livingston, the Sequids possess firemen who are attempting to help anyone who didn't escape during the fight. Meanwhile, at the Pentagon under construction, Immortal is revived after being decapitated. A happy Kate sees him alive, and Donald tells him that he can take his leave. Immortal decides that he will be retiring to start a family with Kate, much to her happiness. Cecil calls upon Black Samson, Robot, Britt, Donald, and Mark to the Pentagon. He informs the 4 of Kate and Immortal's retirement, Darkwing's death, and many of the Guardians being out of commission. He says that the world is largely undefended. Samson says that Shapesmith will be fine since his physiology doesn't work the same way as humans. He tells them of a core, which is the main organ of a Martian. As long as it remains, he can recover. Robot tells him that he will join temporarily, and Bulletproof's hand is fixed, stating that he was uninjured otherwise. Mark asks about Rex and Robot informs him of his death, much to Mark's sorrow. Mark asks why he's here, and Cecil asks him to lead the new Guardians of the Globe. Mark refuses, citing that Eve's condition doesn't make him fit to lead. Cecil decides on Britt to lead the Guardians, much to his confusion. Mark leaves and Samson says that he will help as well. Mark begins helping with the cleanup effort and notices many dead bodies, much to his depression. Just then, an old Viltrumite arrives to the scene to inform Mark of his Viltrumite duties. He informs Mark if he doesn't help take over the planet, he will replace him, and if he fights back, he will kill him. Mark tells him that it isn't a good time. The man, calling himself Conquest, tells Mark that the Viltrum Empire knew he would resist, which is why he was sent specifically. He tells Mark that he hasn't failed in conquering a planet and how Mark won't survive if fights him. Mark tells him that he was waiting for someone to fight him to get his anger out, so the duo charge into each other, causing a large shockwave around the area. Mark and Conquest charged into each other, and the shockwave causes a large amount of debris to rise up as well as workers to lose their balance. Conquest easily overpowers Mark, crashing him through a building. He tells him of how Anissa, the woman who came to Mark previously, would be telling him of how stupid Mark would be to stop the Viltrumites from making Earth their planet. Conquest goes on to say that he doesn't care and wants Mark to resist because he enjoys it. Mark uses the opportunity to punch him. Conquest isn't affected and smiles. Mark becomes angry and rushes into him, sending him through the building. Conquest lifts the debris and holds Mark by his neck with one arm. Mark smashes his fist on his temple. Conquest smiles and replies, "Very good." Mark punches him again and launches him into orbit. Conquest smiles again and charges him back to the stratosphere. Mark breaks his hold, citing that he tried it already. Conquest states enough games and punches Mark, breaking one of his monocles. Mark flies down at a fast speed while Conquest pummels him. Mark holds a hand over his eye, which was severely brushed from Conquest's punch. Oliver, Debbie, and her boyfriend Paul witness Mark's battle on the news. Oliver rushes to help him, worrying Debbie. Paul assures her that the duo can handle the battle. Oliver attempts to catch up to Conquest and Mark, but the duo are moving at a speed too fast for him. Mark attempts to talk with Conquest, but Conquest refuses to stop since he's enjoying the battle. Oliver ambushes him, and Conquest demands to know who he is. Mark rushes to save Oliver and throws him aside so he can escape. Conquest pushes Mark down with his elbow at his neck. Mark headbutts Conquest, much to his amusement. He catches Mark's last punch and says if this is all the strength he has, he will likely die. Under the Pentagon, Cecil learns of the battle and rushes to see if D.A. Sinclair has the 4 alternate Marks ready as Reaniman. Sinclair informs him that their dense tissue makes him unable to cut through to make the Reaniman process. Cecil looks in horror, stating, "Then God help us all." Adam and Betsy Wilkins watch the news by Eve as she wakes up. The news mistakenly believes Conquest to be Omni-Man. Eve wakes up after 2 days of being in a coma, asking where Mark is. She sees Mark fighting on TV and rushes to ready to help. She accidentally reveals his identity as Invincible. Eve tells a doctor to get Cecil to transport her to the battle. Conquest tosses Mark around effortlessly and reveals that he met his father while Nolan was younger, showing that he is much older than Nolan. Oliver interrupts and catches him off guard and helps Mark up. Oliver uses Conquest's advanced stage as a reason they can beat him. Conquest argues that him being old doesn't mean you should underestimate him. He swats Mark away to fight Oliver. He punches Oliver, making him lose many teeth and breaks his arm. Conquest attempts to rip him in half, but Mark stops him. He goes back to fighting Mark, and Cecil has a med team pick up Oliver. A concerned Debbie learns that Oliver is alive, and Paul comforts her. William, Rick, Amber Bennett, Gary, and Art watch in horror seeing Mark being beaten to death. Conquest launches him into a destroyer ship over an island. Mark punches Conquest and Eve arrives to assist Mark, much to Mark's horror. Mark attempts to hold him off, but Conquest breaks Mark's leg, causing him to shriek in pain. Eve holds Conquest into a bubble, but he easily breaks out of it. Conquest easily pummels Eve and impales her, nearly killing her in the process. Mark catches Eve and begs for her to live, grieving and crying. Conquest witnesses him care much for Eve and admires it, stating that it breeds weakness for Viltrumites. Conquest licks the blood from his finger and thanks Mark for the battle. Mark says that he doesn't care how strong or fast Conquest is and says that he won't live to see tomorrow. Conquest laughs in Mark's face and tells Mark to do his worst, and the duo charge into one another. The duo punches one another, causing Mark to break his forearm and Conquest's cybernetic arm to be destroyed by the impact. An amused Conquest is distracted and Mark attacks him. Conquest attempts to bear hug Mark, but Mark bites him, tearing off his muscle tissue. While Conquest and Mark fight, Eve wakes up from her near-death state and rebuilds her body. Mark pummels Conquest until he is distracted by Eve's revival. Conquest punches while he is distracted and Eve fires a beam of energy at Conquest, burning much of his skin. A naked Eve loses consciousness and Conquest goes to kill Eve, but Mark begins to pummel Conquest, saying that he won't touch Eve. He catches his punch and breaks Mark's hand, causing him to scream in pain. An amused Conquest laughs as Mark is in pain, but Mark headbutts Conquest to the point where his face is disfigured. Then, Mark loses consciousness and sees a naked and unconscious Eve. Mark tells Eve that he loves her with her returning it. Soon, the Guardians of the Globe, Youngblood, Savage Dragon, and various superheroes arrive at the scene to help them, but to their surprise, the battle is already over.